Descended from a long line of famed Keldor Jedi, Plo Koon was the last apprentice of the powerful Jedi Master Tyvalka. A hero of the Stark Hyperspace War, Koon ascended to the Council after Tyvalka's death, honoring his mentor's last wishes. An eminent master, Koon had the misfortune of serving during the waning days of the Galactic Republic, and was one of the few surviving participants of the Battle of Geonosis, the start of the Clone Wars. A notable strategist, Koon led Republic forces to victory on such notable battlefronts as Brental 4 and Korm, among others, and survived engagements with some of the most deadly and capable Darksiders of the time. Ultimately, however, Koon was shot down above Cato Nimordia by his own clone troopers, in accordance with Order 66. One of the initial victims of the Great Jedi Purge, the details of his death were falsified in Imperial reports, part of a smear campaign against the downfallen Jedi Order. Darth Vader, formerly the Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, was the Sith apprentice of Darth Sidious, recruited on the eve of the Great Jedi Purge in 19 BBY. Arguably the greatest Jedi killer of all time, Vader spearheaded the sack of the Jedi Temple and butchered the Separatist Council on Mustafar, ending the Clone Wars and helping to usher in the reign of the Galactic Empire. However, he was confronted by his former Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, and after a lengthy duel through the mineral refineries of Mustafar, he was defeated. Left to die in the hellish landscape, Vader suffered severe injuries, necessitating an extensive cybernetic refit to keep him alive. His physical and force-based abilities were severely hampered, the weight of the prosthetics compromising his agility, and the lack of living tissue preventing the force from properly flowing through his body. Despite his disadvantages, Vader adapted quickly, becoming the enforcer of the newly minted Emperor Palpatine. Darth Vader was finally beaten in 4 ABY by his own son, Luke Skywalker. However, Luke spared his life, rejecting the dark side of the Force and prompting Palpatine's wrath. Vader stepped in to defend his son, killing Palpatine, but suffering fatal damage to his cybernetics, which resulted in his death. Alright, I admit it. The only reason why I'm doing this matchup at all is because of the collaboration between Matt Chatman and myself. Matt's breakdown of Plo Koon gave me a very high opinion of the character, and I started thinking that he might actually be fair competition for Darth Vader. As I haven't used Vader for quite some time, and since Matt essentially did half the work for me when he drafted his statistics for Plo Koon, I decided to go for it. In my own defense, while I did use Matt's breakdown of Koon as reference when drafting my own, I did my best to insert a lot of my own commentary into this so that I'm not just parroting him. On another note, I will be acknowledging Plo Koon's appearances in the television series Star Wars The Clone Wars and its tie-in material. I will be releasing a video shortly where I detail my policy for how I deal with the information and retcons perpetrated by the show, but for now, a brief explanation. This is done out of necessity, as Plo Koon simply isn't featured heavily enough in the classical sources for me to be able to draft an accurate and proper set of statistics for him, as he only took part in battlefield engagements and didn't participate in any lightsaber duels. So in this instance, and as much as I hate to admit it, TCW does serve a role. I don't mean to be a hair-splitting hypocrite, but that's how the wind blows this time around. And now that all of that is out of the way, please enjoy Plo Koon versus Darth Vader. Plo Koon was renowned as one of the greatest swordmasters in the Jedi Order, his skills so formidable that even Darth Maul, an arrogant Sith apprentice driven by a fanatical hatred of the Jedi Order, acknowledged Koon as a great warrior, regarding a possible contest with him as a proper test of his own abilities. During the Clone Wars, Plo Koon engaged the infamous Jedi hunter Asajj Ventress, standing toe-to-toe with her despite also sporting a broken arm, an especially notable feat as Ventress was skilled enough to match other Jedi Council masters besides Koon, even outright defeating Kit Fisto. Koon may not have properly defeated her, but he clearly dominated the combat despite his disadvantage, meeting her assault with obvious ease and using every tool at his disposal to keep her off balance while he fortified his position. Master Koon was a noted specialist in Form 5 lightsaber combat, mastering both the Xian and the Djemso variants. Created in answer to the perceived weaknesses of Form 3 Surisu, Xian was similarly geared towards blast deflection, but turned this defensive move into a form of counterattack by deliberately aiming deflected bolts back at the shooter. Djemso came into play in lightsaber duels, following the same pattern of using defensive moves to set up for immediate counters, but using fierce power blows to drive the offensive. He supplemented this advanced specialization with some training in Ataru, the fourth form, a highly aggressive style that emphasized the incorporation of acrobatics and unarmed combat techniques. While Ataru's influence on his swordplay was negligible, it did point to a broad knowledge base. In keeping with traditional perceptions of Form 5, Plo Koon was a dedicated power duelist noted for his uncommon physical strength. But while his swordplay was strong and forceful, it was also slow and somewhat cumbersome. Koon didn't rely on speed when executing his strikes. His assets were instead timing and precision. He can't strike faster than the opponent can defend, so he needs his blows to connect at just the right moment in just the right place to achieve the desired effect. However, while his blade work was very deliberately paced, this did not mean that Koon was an immobile rock, as he was in fact quite nimble, a talented acrobat. Form 5 lightsaber combat may be noted for its lack of mobility, but Koon both compensated for the detriments of this and turned it into an asset. He relied on his strength and his endurance to hold his ground and power through, while relying on judiciously applied acrobatics to maneuver. Very much in keeping with the connotations associated with the Xian style, Plo Koon was highly skilled at blast deflection, and possessed a great deal of battlefield effectiveness against multiple opponents and groups. While there is no evidence that Plo Koon had been trained in the use of dual blades and saber staffs, he proved that he can effectively combat such armaments, as shown in his engagements with both Asajj Ventress and Savage Opress. In his duels with Ventress, Koon was able to adapt to radical changes of style and weaponry, and continued to effectively defend and retaliate, bringing the fight to her. While Koon has never been observed incorporating physical strikes and grapples into his lightsaber sequences, he is known to be an expert at unarmed combat. While his apparent weakness against such strikes during his engagements with Ventress and Opress may suggest otherwise, one must examine the circumstances before making such a judgment. During his duel with Ventress, he was suffering from a broken arm, which would have compromised his ability to employ and counter such techniques, and during his duel with Opress, he may have simply judged that such techniques would be ineffective against the hulking brute. Probably a good call. However, Koon very freely makes use of his skill at incorporating force-based attacks into his lightsaber sequences. Alongside a number of other Jedi Council masters, including Yoda, Koon took part in a martial arts exhibition intended to demonstrate the superiority of power in the Force over physical technique, a precept that very much defined his method and approach. Plo Koon used every tool at his disposal, employing his lightsaber skills and his Force abilities in equal measure to maximize his own destructive potential. As a tactician and strategist, Koon was ingenious, making rapid situational assessments and quickly laying out effective plans of action. Plo Koon operates best while working in concert with others on a chaotic battleground, freely applying his tactical mind and willingness to persevere through the idea that the best defense is a good offense. During his duel with the Sage Ventress on Korm, he demonstrated his skill by prioritizing his targets and employing the combat itself as a greater strategic tool, keeping her occupied and preventing her from reinforcing her troops while his allies seized control of the facility. Simply put, he knows how to control a fight. With such a subtle command of lightsaber combat, force abilities, and tactical ingenuity at his disposal, Plo Koon was capable of overwhelming most adversaries outright. Those he can't simply power through, he can outmaneuver and manipulate. And even if he can't accomplish that, he can still endure and outlast the opposition. Plo Koon was essentially the embodiment of the Form 5 maxim of peace through superior firepower. He was a practical, pragmatic Jedi who developed his powers with the goal and intent of striking out at evil and injustice, attacking social decay at its root. Unlike Anakin Skywalker, who is completely preoccupied with firepower for its own sake, Koon's ultimate goal was bringing and keeping peace. He simply believed assertive action was required to accomplish this. Darth Vader was a natural talent with the lightsaber, and this aptitude allowed him to develop into one of the preeminent swordmasters of the era. During his career as a Sith Lord, much of his skill was ironically due to the injuries he suffered after his defeat on Mustafar. The severe physical handicaps forced him to completely rebuild his fighting style from the ground up, resulting in a unique and calculated method. He retained the mastery of the Gem So that he attained as a Jedi, as its focus on brute force power attacks put his cybernetically augmented strength to good use. Even his most casual moves could potentially stagger opponents. However, he was no staid Form 5 master, but a highly creative fighter who mixed and matched forms, using the Gem So as the backbone for a personalized hybrid style that borrowed elements from all lightsaber forms. While brute force was one of the defining elements of Vader's fighting style, he wasn't some barbarian hefting a cudgel. Vader's technique was described as crisp and unpredictable by Oli Starstone on Kashyyyk, and she noted both his precision and economy of motion. Designed to suit his own needs, Vader's hybrid form was intended to compensate for the weaknesses imparted by his cybernetics, protecting the vulnerable components and making up for his hampered mobility. Refining his footwork, he regained a measure of his old agility, but turned his immobility into an asset, relying on his supreme endurance and strength to carry him through. When fighting defensively, he was an immovable object. When seizing the offensive, he used his size and bulk to remain grounded, while he simply unleashed his overwhelming power blows, hammering adversaries into submission. Utterly ruthless, Darth Vader never employed anything less than a killing blow. Despite his handicaps, he had no difficulty at all with blast deflection, and retained a high level of effectiveness against multiple opponents and groups, even outfencing multiple Jedi. He even boasted some skill as a marksman, perfectly willing to employ a blaster when the situation demanded it, despite his ingrained distaste for such weapons, and on one occasion he even wielded one as a secondary weapon alongside his lightsaber. On the topic of secondary weapons, Vader had also trained in dual-blade fencing as a Jedi, studying Nyman and Ataru specifically for this purpose, and even applying this skill in combat on multiple occasions. However, as a Sith Lord, Vader clearly favored a single blade over an array of weapons, and while he has brandished dual sabers, he has never been observed actually fighting with them. But his skill with this armament did not come to nothing, as Vader has been observed capably defending against dual-bladed assaults. The only duelist capable of properly overpowering Vader with this type of armament was the resurrected Darth Maul, a martial artist of comparable skill. Starkiller doesn't count, as Vader successfully disarmed him and was only subdued when his adversary resorted to his Force abilities. An expert at unarmed combat, Vader's effectiveness in this arena was initially the result of his cybernetic augmentations, heavy armor allowing him to shrug off any physical strikes that actually landed, while his prosthetic hands increased the effectiveness of his own attacks, however crude they were. As he trained and developed his method, he eventually devised quite a sophisticated barehanded fighting method, and while he did so only rarely, he was an expert at incorporating such physical strikes and grapples into his lightsaber sequences. Darth Vader was also an expert at incorporating various force-based attacks into his overall offensive. While he did study Nyman as a Jedi, his skills in this area were instead based off of the Dun Mosh tactic. Dun Mosh was the Sith school of psychological warfare tactics, based around verbal taunts to expose inner doubts and fear, disrupting an adversary's focus, and the showboating of superior force abilities and lightsaber skills in order to intimidate targets, cowing them into submission. Vader has employed everything from basic force pushes and shoves to advanced telekinetic throws, pummeling his targets with all available loose objects, sometimes while simultaneously attacking them with his lightsaber. Thanks to his expertise in Dun Mosh, Vader was a tactical genius, exceedingly skilled at manipulating his opponents and controlling the fight. Whereas Anakin Skywalker simply cut loose and unleashed an overwhelming offensive barrage, channeling his emotions into his attack, Darth Vader played it smart, having learned from the examples of both of his teachers. A fight is never a goal in itself. Sometimes it is simply a distraction from the true goal, and best countered with a larger distraction. Vader was an expert at the larger distraction end of things, and many of his most successful battles have been deeply rooted psychological manipulations. Terror was a weapon that Darth Vader wielded with practiced ease. Thanks to his broad skill set and clever incorporation of a wide variety of combat techniques, Darth Vader's fighting style was incredibly varied. While entirely capable of cutting loose with vicious overhand power blows, his typical fighting method was a sophisticated offensive, precise and conservative. When fighting defensively, he shifted to a one-handed grip and relied on a clearly Makashi-inspired moveset, efficiently deflecting attacks while countering with deft lunges and slashes. However, when driven onto his back foot, Vader fought extremely cautiously, with his elbows locked to his sides, working his blade with his wrists only changing positions or leaping when forced to. This final method was only employed when Vader was desperate or fearful of his opponent, as it was entirely geared towards protecting the vulnerable components of his respirator and left his limbs exposed. Fortunately, his armor allowed him to shrug off anything short of a lethal blow. On the whole, while Vader's lightsaber technique lacked the polish of the great Form 5 masters of the Jedi Order, it would be foolish to call it crude. A refined swordmaster, he wielded his sophisticated hybrid form with utter confidence. Appropriately for a being more machine than man, Darth Vader fought like a droid, ruthless, utilitarian, and direct in action. While this vicious fighting style has been described as antique, few of Vader's adversaries were capable of defending against it. When analyzing their martial arts skill specifically, ignoring all other factors, it becomes very difficult to call. On the one hand, Darth Vader incorporates a wide range of alternative skills and elements in his fighting style, resulting in something quite unique, whereas Plo Koon only supplemented Xi'an with Ataru, and while it provided him with a broader knowledge base, it didn't affect his swordplay in any major way. Vader's greater level of variety speaks to a higher level of skill, but Koon has proven that he can withstand such sophisticated swordplay and tactics, his focus on precision and timing standing him in good stead against Vader's more refined swordplay. Koon has only demonstrated a vulnerability against the most extreme and barbaric of measures, though a simple brute force assault wouldn't be enough, as he is capable of weathering such a storm. Plo Koon and Darth Vader represent two completely different applications of Form 5 lightsaber combat, with Koon's swordplay representing the purest expression of Xian, whereas Darth Vader's lightsaber technique is very much unique to him, with his adherence to Djemso reflected by his entire skill set and approach, with both the lightsaber and the Force. But at the same time, both have a great many attributes in common. Both are offensive powerhouses with strong defenses, and both are largely stationary duelists who rely on their strength and endurance to power through, while using judiciously applied acrobatics to maneuver. Purely in terms of martial arts training, there is no clear advantage one way or the other where these two are concerned, and their tactical ingenuity doesn't break this tie either, as both are experts at using their surroundings to their advantage to control a fight, and Koon's emotional balance means that Vader's psychological warfare tactics wouldn't accomplish much. What results is a stalemate, with both equally capable of withstanding the other's attacks. As the primary purpose of both of their fighting styles is maintaining long-term offensive viability, a stalemate essentially turns this contest into an endurance run. While physical endurance and stamina are influenced by martial arts training and style, they are ultimately determined by a completely different set of factors, and accordingly wouldn't have any bearing on this conclusion. As neither combatant has a conclusive advantage in a contest of pure martial skill, I declare Plo Koon and Darth Vader equal as martial artists and lightsaber duelists. A Keldor from Doran, Plo Koon was noted for his uncommon physical strength and endurance. Keldor are noted for having quicker reflexes than humans, though weaker constitutions, demonstrated when Koon suffered a broken arm during an avalanche on Korm, blaming this on brittle bones, the result of his then advanced age. On the flip side, Keldor physiology provides greater protection against environmental extremes, to the point where they can survive brief exposure to the vacuum of space. Keldor also possess sensory organs that allow for a form of telepathy, a trait which is in turn further enhanced by Koon's force sensitivity and Jedi training. However, Keldor physiology also leaves Koon saddled with a serious physical weakness. Keldor evolved in a helium atmosphere and cannot survive in oxygenated environments without a breath mask and goggles. For Plo Koon, this equipment represented an obvious point of vulnerability, one that has very nearly resulted in his death. A human male originally born on Tatooine, Darth Vader was left more machine than man, as a result of the near-total cybernetic reconstruction done to keep him alive after the severe injuries he suffered on Mustafar. Many of his internal organs were replaced or supplemented with implants, all of his limbs were prosthetic, and he required a respirator to breathe. Due to the severity of his condition, his reconstruction was rushed. The prosthetic limbs were badly made, affecting his mobility, and the top-heavy armor threw off his balance, forcing him to completely revise his lightsaber style to compensate. Vader learned to live with his situation, and in fact started taking advantage of his cybernetics. Thanks to his prosthetic limbs, his strength was superhuman, and a constant dose of painkiller and other drugs granted him almost unlimited stamina and endurance. The armor itself protected him from injury and attack. He can shrug off minor lightsaber hits and, among other things, has withstood immediate proximity to a grenade explosion. Vader has been torched, shot, exposed to hard vacuum, even buried alive, and he has still walked away. However, Vader was not without his weaknesses. The armor and cybernetics, while durable, were extremely sensitive to electrical discharges. Low-level bursts would cause the prosthetics to seize up, while high-energy barrages would completely disable everything, leaving him a helpless quadriplegic. While the redundant mechanisms built into the respirator allowed him to breathe unassisted for a brief time, once it failed, he suffocated. The prime attribute of both is their strength and endurance, and thanks to his cybernetics, Vader completely outclasses Koon in both. While the Jedi Master is tough, the Sith Lord can shrug off injuries that would cripple him, and on more than one occasion, he has even endured the loss of limbs and kept on going. Both do possess major weaknesses in the form of their breath masks, but Vader's respirator wasn't nearly as vulnerable as Koon's anti-ox mask. As described in Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, Vader's entire fighting style was designed to compensate for and protect his vulnerable cybernetics. Darth Vader gets the physical edge. A powerful Jedi Master and a lifelong member of the Jedi Council, Plo Koon possessed a wide palette of powers, many of them obscure, along with the willingness to use them, the result of his inborn Keldor tendency to view issues in black and white. While just as much a servant of the Force as any other Jedi, Koon viewed it as the means through which to strike out at injustice, and so was more inclined to employ it offensively than most Lightsiders. Physical augmentation to allow for superhuman feats of speed, strength, and agility was the bread and butter of all Jedi-trained Force wielders. However, while Koon was clearly just as well versed in this power as any other Jedi, his applications of it were much more restrained and judicious than was the norm. Superhuman acrobatics were one of the cornerstones of his method, and he did enhance his reflexes to allow for feats such as blast deflection, but he fought at a very sedate pace, relying on precision and timing rather than mind-numbing speed, using acrobatics to maneuver around the battlefield, rather than to set up for attacks. Rather than pumping the engine full of nitrous oxide and just going, he only employed this power as needed, and otherwise relied on his native physical capabilities. Labeled a telekinetic savant, Plo Koon was an expert at applying this power combatively. Basic pushes and shoves to off-balance or disable enemies were one of his primary tools, and he has even successfully employed them against opposing Force wielders, proving that he is capable of penetrating the Force shields that other adepts use to defend themselves against such attacks, a notable feat even for Jedi Masters. He backed up this capability with the use of telekinetic throws, using loose objects for both offensive and defensive purposes, and most impressively, Koon seamlessly incorporated such powers into his lightsaber sequences, using every tool at his disposal to its full potential. Keldor already possessed a natural aptitude for telepathy, a trait that was further enhanced by Koon's Force sensitivity, resulting in a formidable level of aptitude with such powers. In addition to basic mind tricks to influence weak-willed subjects, he has surreptitiously probed the minds of specific targets without giving away his intrusion. Most notably, he took advantage of the strong Force bond he shared with his niece to directly communicate with her from halfway across the galaxy, by extension allowing himself to maintain contact with the Jedi Council during the Stark Hyperspace War. Arguably, Plo Koon's most infamous power was his personalized application of Force lightning, referred to as electric judgment, which he believed to be an innate ability for him. While he learned of lightning as an initiate at the Jedi Temple, he never had any special interest in it, and was never compelled to experiment with it. The first time he used the ability was to subdue the criminal Pommel before he could abduct and murder a small girl, and while he believed he employed it instinctively, he noted that he was calm and in control. He wasn't motivated by anger or desperation. Afterwards, he continued to develop his skills with it, concluding that it would be irresponsible to ignore its usefulness and potential, regardless of the negative connotations associated with it. While not as strong as Sith lightning, nor typically used as a lethal weapon by Koon, Electric Judgment did have the capability to kill. In addition to the powers he learned from the Jedi, Plo Koon also possessed a number of abilities outside of the Jedi Orthodox that he learned from other groups or developed himself. As a member of the Barando Sages of Doran, Koon studied the Anya Sef technique, which was used to guard against telepathy and intrusive monitoring of brain activity. Another unorthodox ability in his arsenal was Malacia, a power that influenced the bodily functions of a subject and could be used to induce dizziness and nausea. Koon's extensive scientific knowledge enabled him to develop powers that allowed him to influence the environment around him, such as freezing small bodies of water or creating a dense fog to provide cover. As in all things, Plo Koon was practical and pragmatic, both a highly capable general-purpose force wielder and a formidable combative one, commanding both great power and fiendish subtlety. A master of a broad range of force abilities, he employed every tool at his disposal to accomplish the task at hand, and he was perfectly willing to use the Force as a lethal weapon. Prior to his crippling injuries, Anakin Skywalker was the most powerful natural force-sensitive currently living, with the potential to completely outstrip both Jedi Grandmaster Yoda and the Dark Lord of the Sith Darth Sidious. However, as the Force is generated and channeled by living tissue, the loss of so much of it after his defeat crippled his ability to fully wield this power. Despite this, Vader worked hard to overcome his handicaps, rebuilding his skill set from the ground up and developing into a formidable Sith Lord, standing out as one of the most powerful Darksiders of the era. In some ways, Force-based physical augmentation was rendered redundant by Vader's cybernetics, but in other ways it was made more necessary than ever. His hampered mobility made the empowerment of speed and reflexes vital, and when necessary, he was capable of moving faster than the eye could perceive through judicious applications of force speed. Vader possessed a high level of aptitude with telekinesis, and it was one of his most prominent powers. His favorite method of killing was telekinetic strangulation, a skill he refined for both torture and murder, on one occasion crushing a subject's heart, or choking out multiple targets at a time. On a more basic combative level, he's employed everything from simple pushes and shoves to advanced throws, using all available loose objects as deadly projectiles, this clear focus on brute force demonstrating the influence of Form 5 lightsaber combat on all of his skills. He even refined the deadly lightsaber throw, striking down targets from a distance. But most impressively, Vader almost seamlessly incorporated such offensives into his lightsaber sequences, in accordance with the norms of the Dun Mosh tactic. A highly skilled telepath, Vader has employed everything from basic mind tricks to long-distance communication to probing the minds of specific subjects for information. He has even successfully employed this power against opposing Force wielders, the most notable example being when he learned that Leia Organa was his daughter while probing the mind of Luke Skywalker. Vader has also employed telepathy in a combative manner, freezing a target in place while he attacked, though this wasn't something he usually employed. Arguably, Vader's biggest handicap as a Sith Lord was his inability to use Force lightning. Lightning could only be generated and cast by a living flesh and blood hand, and all of Vader's limbs were prosthetics, so any attempt to generate lightning would have caused it to backfire on himself. Vader developed a certain level of aptitude with Tutaminis, or force deflection, using it to catch or redirect blaster bolts. However, he was incapable of using it to manipulate force lightning as a means of defense. That being said, he wasn't completely defenseless against lightning. Vader had some aptitude with Sith magic, on one occasion transforming a target into a Rakghoul monster. However, he only employed this feat while in close proximity to the Myrrh Talisman, a powerful Sith artifact. Similarly, he only employed the obscure power Kinetite, a blast of pure, glowing kinetic energy, while in close proximity to the Kyber crystal, another powerful Force artifact. As such, I do not think these skills are ordinarily part of Vader's arsenal. Most notably, Vader has used the power of the dark side to sustain himself when subjected to otherwise fatal trauma, essentially willing himself to continue living. It was because of this that he survived on Mustafar, and because of this that he survived being buried alive during the invasion of the Atuan system, holding out for days. When questioned afterwards by Palpatine on how he accomplished this, Vader simply remarked, "The dark side gave me all I needed." While this ability to simply keep living enabled him to survive without his respirator equipment, it only manifested itself during moments of great rage, and all of his attempts to harness it and use it to overcome his handicaps went nowhere. In previous videos, I have compared Darth Vader to Beethoven after he went deaf, and I stand by this. In both instances, the individual in question was a natural talent who had his primary ability ripped away, forcing him to completely revise his skill set from the ground up to compensate, and ultimately becoming greater than he ever would have otherwise. Anakin Skywalker had the potential to develop into the greatest Force wielder of all time, but he never would have truly tapped into this unless forced to. All of his most notable feats were acts of will motivated by necessity, not powers that he had developed and refined and could wield consistently. While the scope of Vader's abilities were severely limited by his cybernetics, and most energy-based attacks were impossible for him to execute, his applications of the abilities he did have at his disposal were fluid and extremely varied. Yes, Vader will never have what he could have had, but he knows how to make what he does have count. While Plo Koon was much more of an offensive powerhouse than most Jedi, he's not nearly so dedicated to combative abilities as Darth Vader. Koon uses his Force talents subtly and in moderation, whereas Vader is defined by brutal excess. They employ telekinesis in a similar manner, seamlessly incorporating it into their lightsaber sequences, but Vader simply takes it further, commanding a greater level of magnitude. Koon has never shown any evidence of a vulnerability against telekinetic attacks a la Obi-Wan Kenobi, but he would still be hard-pressed to defend against the overwhelming power Vader is bringing to the field. Telepathy is a non-issue, as Vader may have successfully employed it against other Force wielders, but Koon's knowledge of the Anya Seth technique renders it ineffective, and Vader's own mental defenses nullify Koon's skills. Similarly, Vader's knowledge of Sith magic and Kinetite are also off the table, as he wouldn't have access to either of the artifacts that enable him to use such powers. Koon's manipulation of the environment around him would also amount to nothing, as these powers have a certain degree of labor intensity that makes them impractical as combative abilities, and using a dense fog as cover wouldn't really accomplish much, due to Vader's refined Force senses and the sensory enhancements built into his armor. A notable advantage in Plo Koon's corner is his knowledge of Force lightning, and while his application lacks the destructive potential of proper Sith lightning, it does have the capacity to kill. However, this is not a game-changing advantage, because while Vader is incapable of defending against lightning purely with his Force abilities, he isn't helpless against it, and does have a number of viable countermeasures. Ultimately, Koon's advantages over Vader are minor compared to the massive power Vader commands. They may employ similar tactics and methods, but Vader is far more overwhelming than Koon. Darth Vader gets the edge as a Force wielder. Plo Koon wielded a rugged, heavy-duty lightsaber, its design based off of the weapon carried by the ancient Jedi Lacanis Subartuk, a model that went on to inspire the Sentinel hilt used by members of the new Jedi Order. 11 inches long and composed of alloy metal, the hilt's most notable feature was the conical radiator segment on the pommel, with the control switches positioned just above it. The ridged hand grip was positioned along the upper half of the hilt, just below the emitter. As noted in the guidebook Star Wars Lightsabers, hilts with the hand grip situated towards one end or the other were intended to facilitate two-handed grips in fighting styles, bolstering Koon's strength-oriented application of Form 5 lightsaber combat. The lightsaber employed a single Adagan crystal as the focusing lens, originally of gold coloration, but later replaced with a blue one. Simply put, Darth Vader's lightsaber was a power tool. Following the heavy-duty design typical of Form 5 specialists, the lightsaber featured a large ridged hand grip, a throttle-style activator, forward-mounted adjustment switches, and a beveled emitter shroud. While closely following the design of his Jedi lightsabers, Vader was forced to enlarge the hand grip to accommodate his massive cybernetic hands, resulting in a weapon that he himself regarded as inelegant and ungainly. Mechanically, it utilized a heavy-duty D-adium power cell and initially employed a single red-hued synthetic crystal as the focusing lens, but Vader later replaced it with a red-hued Adagan crystal. The lightsaber included a dual-phase function, allowing Vader to rapidly change between two preset blade lengths with the flick of a switch. His preferred lengths appeared to be a standard meter-long blade and a considerably longer meter-and-a-half blade, allowing him to attack from a distance. Plo Koon's lightsaber features some interesting design details, but it's ultimately just a standard, nondescript Jedi lightsaber, whereas Vader's lightsaber, despite its inelegance, is a sophisticated device that provides him with more options in combat. The dual-phase functionality allows him to get the drop on his opponents, and the improved cutting power of a Sith blade can potentially cause a Jedi lightsaber to short out, breaking the blade in a manner of speaking. Darth Vader gets the edge in weaponry. As Force wielders and martial artists, Plo Koon and Darth Vader very much fall into the same mold, essentially representing the two facets of Form 5 lightsaber combat. The core idea behind Form 5 was peace through superior firepower, and what Koon represented was the Jedi interpretation of this concept, maintaining peace through assertive action but not necessarily violence. He was justice, not vengeance. Darth Vader represented the Sith interpretation, the idea that meaningful change could only be achieved through the imposition of one's will and the domination of others. The goal was control. Peace wasn't even on the agenda. It essentially boiled down to the peacekeeping tool versus the destructive weapon. While their techniques were very similar, their approaches were entirely different. However, Koon's restraint should not be mistaken for weakness, nor Vader's brutality for crudeness. As far as pure martial arts training goes, both of them base their methods and approaches around their ability to endure and power through just about anything, meaning that any sort of contest between these two would be a lengthy slugging match. One thing that must be considered is Vader's familiarity with Plo Koon's reputation and skills. He would conduct himself in a very cautious and restrained manner, as he knows exactly what his adversary is capable of. Plo Koon wouldn't have much opportunity to penetrate Vader's defenses because Vader would work hard to avoid providing any openings. The Jedi may land a few solid hits, but nothing Vader couldn't take. But at the same time, Vader wouldn't be able to penetrate Koon's defenses, as his focus on precision and timing stands him in good stead against the more sophisticated elements of Vader's style, and he has the physical ability necessary to combat the Sith Lord's brute force assault. A contest of pure martial arts training and skill between these two would go nowhere, with the final result being decided by their physical capabilities and force powers. In both categories, Koon and Vader possess a great many common attributes. Vader simply possesses them to a greater degree. Both are physically resilient, and both are skilled combative force wielders, but Vader's cybernetics allow him to shrug off injuries that would cripple his adversary, and he is simply a more powerful force wielder. The breathing equipment employed by both was an obvious point of vulnerability, but whereas Koon evidently neglected to devote proper attention to this, Vader's entire fighting style was built around safeguarding these vulnerable components, protecting his center. Plo Koon's aptitude with Force Lightning may be a notable feat, but it's not an unbeatable advantage, as Vader isn't completely defenseless against lightning. Taking down Darth Vader calls for a deft combination of both lightsaber combat and force abilities, and while this is exactly what Plo Koon does, the problem is he isn't powerful enough to actually overwhelm Vader. However skilled Koon is, there is simply more to Darth Vader. His fighting method is far more sophisticated and varied, and he has more forms of attack at his disposal. Plo Koon and Darth Vader have developed their skills down the same avenue, using every tool at their disposal to its furthest extent. Darth Vader has simply progressed further along this road than Master Koon has, and is thusly capable of more. There isn't really any doubt as to which way this fight would go, so the only real question is how it would play out. Visually, I believe the actual fencing bouts between these two would closely resemble what we saw in Vader's engagement with old Ben Kenobi on board the Death Star, as both combatants are dedicated power duelists who value precision, efficiency, and strength over and ahead of blinding speed and agility, and both would be conducting themselves in a very cautious manner. As to how the fight would proceed, I think the most apt comparison would be to Vader's duel with Luke Skywalker on Bespin, though with the crucial difference being that Vader would be fighting in earnest, not toying with his adversary. Plo Koon's resiliency and skill makes him a serious challenge for Vader, and while he would be fighting at a serious disadvantage, it must be understood that he still has a solid chance of pulling through and winning. However, while Vader may be initially content to allow the fight to remain a pure lightsaber duel where the outcome is up in the air, once things escalated to a certain point, he would resort to his force abilities, and Koon would simply be overwhelmed by Vader's superior offensive might. I declare Darth Vader the victor.